in spite of the fact that we see increasing numbers of COVID cases once again with this latest variant. Ontario's health minister says the province is not looking at bringing back any COVID-19 measures anytime soon. Emily Javeski has the details.
The trends emerged after Ontario lifted indoor masking rules in most places, along with most other measures aimed at limiting the spread of COVID-19, like proof of vaccination rules and crowd capacity limits. Christine Elliott says the rise in cases is not unexpected, and the government's following the advice of the province's top doctor. Opposition politicians are calling on the province to explain how it plans to respond to the rising cases. NDP leader Andrea Horwath says the, quote, complete silence from the government and Chief Medical Officer of Health is disconcerting. Emily Javeski, The Canadian Press, Toronto.
Interesting topic about that, and especially the government's reaction to this. And we heard the other day from Dr. Isaac Bogosh, of course, on the program talking about this. And he said, look, if you're going to wait for hospitalization numbers to increase, it's too late by the time you look at those numbers. It's going on now. It's happening now. So what is the government doing, and how are they responding to this? Well, that's one of the things we're going to talk about with our next guest. John Best is the founder and publisher of the Bay Observer, following provincial politics, and he joins us for our weekly session here on the Bill Kelly Show. John, welcome back to the show. Good to have you with us again today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you, Bill.
John, let me just jump in right off the bat on this. The COVID thing, I get more and more an idea here that a lot of people just seem to have the sense that it's over, it's in our rearview mirror, it's not happening anymore. The numbers are increasing again. The medical experts, notwithstanding what our chief medical officer seems to be saying, but people like Dr. Uni and Dr. Bogosh and a number of others are saying, look, this is happening, people. We need to do something about this. Is the government trying to whistle past the graveyard here?
Well, I think they've taken quite a gamble, Bill, in lifting the mandates as they did on the 21st of March. This is a real toss of the dice, I think, for this government. We're 5 weeks away from being into an election campaign, and if these current trends should worsen in any significant way, it's going to be a much tighter election than the polls are suggesting right now. So, I mean, the government is kind of out there a little bit on this COVID response, although, you know, to be honest, we're looking at a province that's 90% vaccinated. I don't think there's a single state in the United States that's anywhere near that. You know, you look at Florida, which is not a great example in many ways with some of the stuff their governor has done, but you really do wonder if it makes any difference at all, quite frankly, whether we have you know, mask mandates or not. You know, I think the public is thoroughly confused at this point. I mean, the Premier is right when he says that Ontario is probably the most vaccinated jurisdiction in probably North America, maybe the world, and yet they lift the mandates. What was it? Almost not quite 2 weeks ago, and these hospital numbers are starting to creep up, and the daily counts are starting to creep up. I guess the only good news, Bill, is that the ICU cases have really not moved hardly at all, and I think that's partly what the government is clinging to.
Yeah, but as Dr. Bogosh told us the other day, he says those numbers are kind of like post-pandemic. He says by the time those numbers are there, it's too late to be preventative. You know, you're being reactive, and it's I think a valid point. We've seen this happen before. And he and a number of other medical experts I've talked to over the last couple of weeks now, John, since the mandate was lifted, are simply saying this was a political decision. It had nothing at all to do with science, and that's not really the way they should be making decisions about something as important as this.
Well, he's probably right, but you know, I don't think the flip side would apply. That if the government had continued the mandates, there clearly was a public fatigue, and it's a juggling act, trying to balance you know, the science, as they say. I guess what it comes down to is you either believe that Dr. Kieran Moore is providing independent advice, or you don't believe him. He's going along with this. Dr. Bogosh, God bless him, he's very photogenic and great interview, but yeah, you know, he's been all over this issue. So I don't know what you do other than we have a medical officer of health, and at this point at least, he's saying we don't need to take extra measures. And I think the other thing that we are seeing, and this is somewhat anecdotal, but the people that are getting sick are not staying sick as long. The severity's not there. A close relative of mine came down with COVID. He's a teacher. And what he tells me, I said, well, what's the protocol for you going back to work? And he said, well, it'll be 5 days, and I'll go back. And you know, a far cry from all this invasive testing and all of that we heard about before. So, you know, I think we've been living with this thing for 2 years. We've received a lot of conflicting advice, and the truth is, I don't think any of us really know what the hell's going on.
Yeah, and that could include some of our elected officials, I suppose, too. In a related issue, though, John, news this week, and it was kind of under the radar with all the other things that have been happening, of course, is the province has announced that the Science Advisory Table, that's the one that was, of course, headed by Dr. Juni, who, by the way, is leaving and going over to the UK. That's, I think, a story in and of itself. They're going to fold the Science Advisory Table into Public Health Ontario, which basically means it's going to become a government agency. So much for independence, so much for free thinking in this. What do you read into this? Is this basically a way for them to simply say, we'll control the message, we don't want any contrary voices out there?
Well, that's certainly, you know, when you do something like that, that's exactly the impression you create. I don't know why they would do that at this time. You're heading into an election. Why would you, what was the urgency to do it now? It opens that very question, Bill. Are they trying to politicize the science? I don't think they are, but why would you make a move like that? Surely it isn't a money issue, or at least let's hope it's not. You know, those are the kind of things that really get the public questioning unnecessarily. You know, if I was giving PR advice, I would say, if you're going to do it some other time. They haven't really explained why they've made that administrative move. So to me, that's a little bit of an unforced error. Could have well waited until some other time this year. I'm sure somebody's got a reason for it, but I think it's one of these situations where it might have actually been a bureaucratic decision. And sometimes they seem to be oblivious to the political realities that are going on around them. You know, with an election 8 weeks away, is this the time to create that kind of question in the public's mind?
Well, and that's the concern that I've got about this. And you and I have been following politics for a long time, and we've seen these sorts of machinations in the past. And I'm trying to, you know, contrast that with what actually has happened, as you mentioned, over the last 2 years while this pandemic is on. God bless the province, because they're the ones that struck this science table in the first place and said, we need all the experts here. And they got around the table, and they appointed Dr. Juni for the job. Dr. Steiny Brown, of course, I think is the one who picked him. But they were an independent voice. And, you know, about a year ago, Dr. Juni was ready to quit. Because he said, you're not following my advice. What am I even here for? He changed his mind. I think they finally talked him off of the ledge. But now he is leaving, and I'm sure there's more of a story to that. But you folded into the ministry, and all of a sudden, well, that means Doug Ford's your boss. You don't have a free opinion on this, and God bless the people that have been the chief medical. We've had a couple of them, you know, since this whole thing started, but they're being paid by the government. And I've been around long enough, and you have enough too, that don't tell me that governments don't have influence over what these people say when they're, you know, working under this sort of pressure. We know that a lot of the decisions the Ford government made over the last 2 years vis-a-vis the pandemic had political overtones, and I'm wondering if this does too.
Well, it does, because we're talking about it in a political program. Yeah. So absolutely, it raises political questions. Whether it's as nefarious as the opposition parties think it is, that's a whole other issue. But certainly, once again, it's this whole communications issue where if you're going to do something, let's have a fulsome explanation of why you're doing it. You know, the steps that you took, the information you received that led you to this conclusion. Why is it going to be better than it was before? So, you know, those are all issues it amazes me, frankly, with all these communications advisors they have, and I've written about Hamilton with 15 communications advisors, and we still get some really bizarre decisions taken. But here we go again. I would imagine that there's thousands of people working for the Ontario government that are supposed to be there to provide communications advice, and you get something like this a month and a bit from the dropping of an election writ.
I know you've been studying the proposal that came out earlier this week from the Ford government too about their housing strategy. And it's a crisis. I mean, that's the word I've used, and I think it's very appropriate given what's going on. There are people that don't have a home. There are a lot of people that can't afford to even put a down payment down on a house. And they've come up with a plan, which I'm sure, John, is going to be one of the key planks of their platform as they move forward to this election that you were just talking about in June. What's your read on this? I mean, I talked about this yesterday, and I got a lot of feedback from people that saying it's a Toronto-centric policy. A lot of the stuff they're trying to do here doesn't relate to Hamilton or London or Ottawa or any place else except for Metro. And I said, well, the reality is there's a lot of votes in Metro Toronto in the GTA, and there's an election coming up. So I wasn't surprised at all by that.
Well, this policy that was announced was supposed to be a response to that housing task force that released its report. That was a private sector driven task force, and they called for much more aggressive measures than the province has actually taken. And Steve Clark, the minister, he admitted, he said, look, we had to water down the legislation because we were just getting so much pushback from municipalities. What the task force recommended was essentially a gutting of planning at the local level. So if a municipality put a restriction on boundary expansion or dragged its feet on approving condo developments, that there'd be almost a fast tracking of it through the Ontario Land Tribunal. Essentially what it would mean is that even more than now, which is frequent, that municipalities would simply be overruled by the Ontario Land Tribunal. Clark, if you really, I read the measures that they announced, and other than this increased tax on foreign speculators, which only represents a tiny percentage of the housing sales in Ontario, and it's not going to move the needle hardly at all. The rest of it is kind of vague, kind of wishy-washy, and I guess they must have thought that they didn't want to go into election with all the municipalities yelling at them. So I just think it's a weak piece of legislation, and it isn't going to accomplish very much. I would expect to see it toughen after the election if this government is returned.
You know what it reminded me of, though? I know we're just about out of time here. Was remember in the late 90s, the Mike Harris government instituted a called a Who Does What panel, and it was all these municipal experts and politicians giving their suggestions on how the relationship between the cities and the province should be. And there's I think they had 40 or 50 recommendations. They picked 2 or 3 of them, and the rest of them are just but you guys probably and one of them, by the way, was regional government. How'd that go over? So I guess that's the right of government, I guess, to be able to cherry pick and say, this one fits what we want to do, so we're going to pick that one. The rest of them we'll just put in the blue box here.
Well, it's the phenomenon. We go back to that article that the Jim Balsillie, the former BlackBerry executive, wrote about a month and a half ago. We don't have the kind of civil service that we had 40 or 50 years ago. Essentially, the civil service, they're managing consultant contracts. You don't have people that actually develop policy the way it used to be done, and the result is we get these kind of half-assed decisions. We get let's throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what we can do. The whole process is becoming less and less professional, and that should be of concern. But nobody's going to campaign on fixing the internal mechanism of government because people's eyes glaze over, and yet it's really an important issue.
It is, really. We have to leave it there. We're just about out of time. John, as always, thanks so much for jumping in with us today for a recount. Lots more to talk about provincially, of course, with the election coming up. Have a great weekend. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Bill.